was obsessed with back then. Eventually we reached our site and I got to work pitching our tent. Brandon waited patiently. He wasn't the type to go running off or anything, and when it was all set up, me and him went for a hike to take in the nature. It was really peaceful. The woods surrounding the campground were calm and serene. There wasn't any animals out and about, but every once in a while I would stop and point out a deer track or some droppings. It reminded me of when I was a kid spending time with my dad. I suppose I was about 9 years old when I learned about the marvels of deer poop myself. As I looked at him, I couldn't help but see a younger version of myself. We had the same eyes, the same hair, and like most of the people in my family, we had the same birthmark on our upper right arm. It was hard spending time with Brandon sometimes. I worked so often and sure, it was putting food on the table, but whenever I saw how fast he was growing without me around, the guilt would start to well up inside me. Seeing him smile and laugh that day really uplifted my spirits though. I was here now, and that's what mattered, is what I'd tell myself whenever the conversation lulled. As we were walking, we suddenly found the trail leading out of the woods and into a beautiful view of the river. I was telling Brandon about erosion and how you could see the effects of the previous year's floods on the riverbank when his expression suddenly changed. He pointed up to the sky and said, "What's that, Dad?" I looked up myself and found that I was just as confused as he was. There was, off in the distance, a dark, triangular-looking object. It hung in the sky perfectly still and then suddenly vanished. Not wanting to lose my reputation as a know-it-all dad, I desperately searched for an explanation, before deciding that it must have been a helicopter and telling Brandon as such. He obviously didn't believe me, and frankly, I didn't believe myself either. By the time we got back to our tent, the sun had already started to set. I got Brandon to help me collect some firewood and start up a fire. We roasted some hot dogs and marshmallows. We didn't get to the scary stories, however, as Brandon started nodding off and I decided it was time for bed. I got Brandon into his sleeping bag and I crawled into mine right beside him. It was the shaking that woke me at first. I had been in an earthquake before, but this was different. It was hard to describe. It was almost like someone was picking up the earth and the earth was trying to pull it back. I was still groggy. I reached out to see if Brandon was awake and I found his sleeping bag empty. I wasn't too panicked yet. Like I said, he wasn't the type to run off, and I always try to keep a level head. I stumbled out of the tent and walked towards where the flashlights were, confident that I would find him near the fire trying to cope with the shaking. Then the lights happened. The whole campground was bathed in a bright, sickly, white light. It was blinding at first, and when my vision adjusted I realized that Brandon was nowhere to be found. That was when I started to panic. I grabbed a flashlight and started shouting his name. As I ran to the edge of the woods surrounding the campsite, I tried looking for a source for the light, but I couldn't see one. As I ran to the edge of the woods, my pounding heart skipped a beat when I heard Brandon's voice. He called out to me, "Dad, I'm over here." I rushed over. My happiness quickly abated when he started crying help. "Something's wrong." I ran to the other side of the campsite and found him crouched away from me in a little ditch. The shaking had mostly subsided and I rushed over to him. He was facing away from the light and I put my hand on his back. "What's the matter? Are you hurt?" I could hear him struggling for air. "Dad," he finally cried, "something's wrong, everything's wrong." His voice was weak. I reached to his hand and when I touched it, alarm bells rang in my head. His skin was rubbery and wrinkly, like a Halloween mask. I turned my flashlight on and his whole skin looked a horrid purple. "Brandon," I muttered in shock. I turned him to face me and screamed. His face was emaciated, his eyes so sunken they looked like a skull's empty sockets. His jaw hanged open like the muscles that held it were worn and worthless. My whole body shook in terror. The shaking started back up again. This time even more violently. It seemed as if the ground was going to get ripped up and thrown into the sky. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed Brandon and held him as close to me as I could. I found myself praying to a God I was never sure actually existed. Through gurgles and moans Brandon started to talk. "It hurts, Dad. Why does it hurt so much? Help me, Dad." As I squeezed him I could feel him get thinner and thinner, like his insides were being sucked out. It felt like there was nothing left of him. Tears started rolling down my face and the last thing I heard him say, faint as a whisper, haunted me. "Why won't you help me, Dad?" A nudge caused me to bolt up in my sleeping bag. Brandon was prodding me. "Wake up, Dad, I'm hungry." I got up, more than a little confused. As my heart stopped racing and I came back to reality, I realized that I had just had a crazy nightmare. I chuckled to myself. After Brandon was fed, I walked over to the ditch from the previous night. There was nothing weird or out of the ordinary. Brandon, too, seemed just like he always was, and didn't mention anything about the previous night. When I walked back to Brandon and asked if he felt the ground shake, he said he hadn't felt a thing. When we got back to civilization, I asked other people the same thing and they all agreed with Brandon. For a week then, my mind was at ease. I worked a lot again that week, and when I finally had a day off, me and the wife took Brandon to the pool. It was only there that memories of that night came flooding back, and the horror with it. When Brandon took his shirt off, I looked at his arm and noticed the family birthmark was missing. Second story. When our camping trip became a nightmare. For as long as I can remember, my family and I have shared a deep love for the great outdoors, particularly the enchanting allure of the forest. The allure of nature's symphony, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the melodious songs of birds never failed to captivate our senses. The verdant foliage, adorned with vibrant flowers, created a kaleidoscope of colors that danced before our eyes, while the towering trees whispered ancient secrets to those who would listen. It was a place where tranquility and serenity embraced us, soothing our souls in the embrace of nature's embrace. Our excursions into the wilderness were often brief, day trips filled with laughter, exploration, and a shared appreciation for the natural wonders around us. But the recent addition of an RV to our family provided an opportunity to embark on a new adventure, an overnight camping trip nestled within the embrace of majestic mountains and the allure of the forest. Excitement bubbled within us as we meticulously planned our journey. We imagined gathering around a crackling fire, its warm glow casting dancing shadows upon our faces. The scent of burning wood mingling with the crisp mountain air would create an intoxicating aroma that would forever be etched in our memories. Finally, the day arrived, and we eagerly set off, our RV becoming our mobile sanctuary. The journey itself was a testament to the beauty of the land we traversed. Majestic peaks rose like sentinels, their snow-capped summits piercing the heavens. As we delved deeper into the heart of nature's domain, our anticipation heightened, and our hearts beat in sync with the rhythm of the forest. Upon reaching our destination, we carefully parked our RV, a tiny fortress amidst the towering giants. The forest seemed to embrace us, its silence broken only by the distant chirping of birds bidding us welcome. The air carried a crispness that invigorated our spirits, as if it whispered tales of forgotten legends and ancient mysteries. With each step we took, the forest welcomed us into its secret realm. Our senses were intoxicated by the sweet aroma of pine needles underfoot, mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil. Sunlight, filtered through the canopy above, created dappled patterns on the forest floor, like nature's own mesmerizing tapestry. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the campsite, we gathered around the fire pit. Amelia, our adventurous and nature-loving daughter, was brimming with excitement at the prospect of building a fire. Amelia's eyes sparkled as she clasped her hands together, her voice filled with anticipation. "Dad, I can't wait to make the fire. Can I help? Please." A smile stretched across my face, mirroring the twinkle in her eyes. I nodded, appreciating her eagerness to participate in this age-old ritual of outdoor adventure. "Absolutely, Amelia," I replied, my voice laced with fatherly pride. "You can gather some dry branches and twigs. Just be careful not to venture too far into the forest." With an enthusiastic nod, Amelia seized a small, weathered basket and darted towards the beckoning trees and rustling underbrush. "Watch out for the prickly bushes, sweetheart," I called out, a touch of caution in my voice. "And remember, stay within sight." Her voice, tinged with determination, floated back to me on the gentle breeze. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll find the best branches." As Amelia vanished into the verdant embrace of the forest, my wife, Emma, emerged from our trusty RV. Her graceful movements belied her quiet excitement as she retrieved the carefully packed food provisions from within. Emma's nimble fingers unwrapped the ingredients with a practiced ease, her eyes glimmering with a mix of culinary artistry and familial warmth. She hummed a gentle tune under her breath, her love for nurturing our family evident in every deliberate action. Meanwhile, I busied myself by unloading the essential cooking equipment from the storage compartments. With the clinking of metal against metal, I extracted the gleaming grill grate and stoked the coals, preparing the stage for a delicious outdoor feast. After a while, with a skip in her step and a glimmer of triumph in her eyes, Amelia emerged from the lush foliage, clutching a trove of dry branches and twigs within the sturdy basket. Yet, nestled in the crook of her other arm was an unexpected treasure, an enchanting discovery that had captured her young heart. Amelia's voice bubbled with excitement as she approached, her words tumbling forth. "Dad, look what I found. It's a small teddy bear. Isn't it adorable?" Curiosity sparked within me as I studied the small, weathered toy she presented. Its once vibrant colors had faded, its fur slightly disheveled, but it bore an undeniable charm. A silent narrative unfolded before my eyes, envisioning the laughter and companionship this cherished possession once brought to another child. A mixture of caution and wonder mingled in my voice as I questioned, "Where did you find it, sweetheart?" "It seems someone may have lost it." Amelia's face radiated with innocence and genuine affection for her newfound friend. "I found it near a tree, Daddy. Maybe another family played here, and the teddy bear got left behind. Can I keep it, please?" My instinctual protective nature rose, a desire to shield her from the potential disappointments that accompany lost treasures. Yet, a tender understanding blossomed within me. This small act of generosity and acceptance would foster her sense of empathy and compassion. Considering her wide-eyed enthusiasm, I yielded to the warmth in my heart. "All right, Amelia," I relented with a gentle smile. "If it brings you joy and reminds you of this beautiful adventure, then you can keep it." Amelia's jubilant squeal filled the air, punctuating the acceptance of her request. With an affectionate hug, she embraced her newfound companion, promising it a future filled with endless tea parties and imaginary adventures. After I set the fire, with a satisfying crackle, the flames sprang to life, dancing and flickering in a mesmerizing rhythm. The golden tendrils reached towards the night sky, casting a warm glow upon our faces. The radiant heat embraced us, dispelling the chill of the evening air as we gathered around the enchanting inferno. I meticulously arranged the equipment we had brought, positioning the sturdy metal grill over the roaring fire. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the tantalizing aroma of seasoned meat, sizzling and sputtering as it made contact with the heated grates. The tantalizing melody of crackling embers serenaded our senses, a symphony of anticipation and contentment. My wife, her eyes sparkling with both determination and tenderness, deftly prepared the ingredients that would transform into a feast of flavors. The rhythmic symphony of chopping, the aromatic dance of herbs and spices, and the gentle sizzle of ingredients meeting the heated pan created a harmonious tableau of culinary artistry. Amelia, wide-eyed and filled with wonder, took her place by my side, her small hands outstretched in eager anticipation. I showed her how to position the meat on the grill, carefully instructing her on the art of achieving the perfect sear. Her youthful enthusiasm ignited a sense of pride within me, as I witnessed her embracing the opportunity to contribute to our family's culinary adventure. "We still need some firewood. I will get some until it gets darker. I will be right back," I told Emma, and I delved deeper into the wilderness. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a symphony of nature enveloping me as I wandered amidst towering trees. My fingers brushed against dry leaves and moss-covered rocks, searching for the elusive twigs and branches necessary to further kindle our flames. But my curiosity led me further ahead, my gaze alighting upon something beyond the ordinary. "What the hell?" I murmured. My voice was like a whisper amidst the wilderness. My heart was quickening as I glimpsed the outline of a vehicle amidst the foliage. It stood solitary and still, like a relic from another time. I hesitated whether or not to go closer, my instincts prickling with unease. Perhaps just another camper, I told myself, though doubt lingered in my mind. I cautiously approached the abandoned camper van, each step echoing in the eerie silence of the forest. A sense of unease crept over me, intensifying with every closer stride. The van, though not ancient, bore the unmistakable marks of neglect and abandonment, standing alone like a forgotten relic amidst the wilderness. "Hello!" My voice broke the stillness, but no reply greeted my inquiry. It was as if the very air held its breath, shrouding the scene in an unsettling silence. Abandonment hung heavy in the air, casting a pall over the once vibrant camping spot. My eyes scanned the scene, taking in the disarray that surrounded the camper. Camping equipment lay strewn haphazardly, a jumbled testament to the hurried departure of its previous occupants. But it was the ominous black stain on the ground that drew my attention, a stark reminder of some past calamity, perhaps a fire that had ravaged this place. As I moved closer, my gaze was drawn to a chilling sight. A massive scraping marred the side of the camper van, like a grotesque scar etched into its metal skin. It seemed almost as if some colossal force had clawed at the vehicle, leaving behind a haunting testament to its power. The stillness of the campsite was oppressive, suffocating, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of some unseen threat. Not even the birds dared to break the silence with their song, lending an unsettling quality to the desolation that surrounded me. With a shiver of apprehension, I realized that I stood on the precipice of a mystery, the unanswered questions hanging in the air like a thick fog. What had transpired in this forsaken place? And more importantly, was I truly alone in this silent wilderness? The hairs were raising on the back of my neck and walked away from the silent sentinel of metal and glass. I retraced my steps through the labyrinth of trees, the distant echo of our footsteps mingling with the whispers of the forest. I was immediately relieved as the warmth of our camp awaited me, and I was not sure if I should tell Emma that I had seen another RV deeper in the forest. I decided not to. It might ruin the warm atmosphere of our moments. The crackling fire and the tantalizing aroma of the cooking meat wove an enchanting tapestry around us, casting a spell that encapsulated the essence of togetherness. As the minutes ticked by, we shared stories, laughter, and the warmth of familial love. The darkness around us seemed to fade away, replaced by the glow of our shared experiences and the promise of a memorable night. In that moment, it was not just the flickering flames that illuminated our campsite, but the intangible bond we shared as a family. We were not merely three individuals gathered around a fire, but a tapestry of love, connection, and shared dreams. The crackling fire served as a beacon, illuminating the path towards a future filled with shared adventures, cherished memories, and an unbreakable bond that would withstand the tests of time. As we reveled in the joyous harmony of food and company, the night sky glittered above, painting a breathtaking backdrop for our intimate gathering. The stars, like sparkling witnesses, bore witness to the magic that unfolded in that humble campsite. In the symphony of crackling flames and joyful chatter, we savored the beauty of simplicity, finding solace and fulfillment in the warmth of our shared presence. It was in this tranquil moment, surrounded by the wilderness and enveloped in the embrace of our loved ones, that we realized the true essence of life's blessings, a serene respite from the world's chaos, and the unrivaled joy of being together, just the three of us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, surrendering the world to the embrace of darkness, a palpable chill crept into the air, sending shivers down our spines. Wisps of mist curled and swirled around us, lending an ethereal quality to the night. Feeling the temperature drop, I retrieved a thick, cozy blanket from the confines of our trusty RV. Its soft fabric, woven with memories of past adventures, held the promise of warmth and comfort. Gently draping the blanket over Emma and Amelia, I ensured their precious forms were shielded from the encroaching cold. Amelia, her energy waning with each passing moment, fought against the drowsiness tugging at her eyelids. Her yawns, like tiny symphonies of weariness, punctuated the tranquility of the evening. Sensing her fatigue, I knelt down beside her, my voice filled with gentle concern. "Sweetheart, it's getting late and you look tired," I whispered, my breath carrying warmth in the crisp night air. "Would you like to go to bed?" Amelia's eyes, still sparkling with the remnants of excitement, met mine. A yawn escaped her lips, a delicate melody of exhaustion. However, her spirit remained steadfast, determined to revel in every last moment of our outdoor escapade. "No, Daddy," she replied, her voice a soft murmur. "I'm not sleepy yet. I want to stay here and enjoy the campfire." Her response resonated with the boundless enthusiasm of youth, and I couldn't help but smile at her unwavering spirit. In that instant, I understood that this was a rare and precious opportunity, a chance to immerse ourselves in the magic of the night, to surrender to the allure of the crackling flames and the mysteries concealed within the darkness. Then I thought of the camper van that I had just seen, and for some reason, it made me feel uneasy. Trying to ignore it, I settled myself beside Amelia, the fire's radiant glow casting enchanting shadows upon our faces. Emma, her hand tenderly clasping mine, joined us, her presence a comforting reassurance amidst the whispering night. As we sat there, the crackling fire casting an otherworldly glow upon our little circle, a symphony of silence enveloped us. The distant chirping of nocturnal creatures mingled with the soft crackling of the firewood, creating a harmonious lullaby that serenaded us into a state of tranquil contentment. Stars, like celestial lanterns, punctured the ink-black canvas above, their shimmering brilliance a testament to the vastness of the universe and the infinite possibilities that lay beyond our mortal reach. The fragrant scent of pine mingled with the smoky essence of the campfire, intoxicating our senses and anchoring us to this moment of fleeting serenity. Time seemed suspended, as if the world had paused to allow us this respite from the frenetic pace of life. We basked in the warmth of the fire, our souls nourished by the shared silence and the bond forged through the simple act of being present with one another. But amidst the tranquil symphony of nature, a rustling in the nearby underbrush shattered the stillness. The sudden disruption reverberated through the air, jolting us from our serene reverie. Emma's eyes widened, her hand instinctively tightening its grip around mine. Amelia, her youthful curiosity piqued, looked to me for reassurance. "What was that, Daddy?" Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. I cast a soothing smile in her direction, my attempt to allay any growing fears. "It's probably just an animal, sweetheart," I reassured her, my voice carrying a calm certainty. "Maybe a deer or a boar exploring the woods. Nothing to be worried about." Yet, as the rustling persisted, growing louder and more distinct, even I couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease gnawing at the edges of my composure. The sound seemed to possess an undeniable weight, suggesting a presence larger and more formidable than initially anticipated. Emma's eyes darted nervously between the surrounding trees, her senses attuned to the slightest movement. "Are you sure, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "It sounds quite substantial." Instinctively, I rose to my feet, my protective instincts surging within me. "Stay here," I instructed, my voice firm but laden with an undercurrent of caution. "I'll go check it out. It's probably just passing through." With cautious steps, I ventured toward the origin of the enigmatic rustling, my ears straining to decipher its source. I thought about the camper van. Was it possible that they could see our fire and wanted some company? That sounded ridiculous. Or could they have been in trouble? I should have checked that vehicle out. Each crackle of twigs underfoot seemed to amplify in the stillness of the night, magnifying my senses. As I neared the tree line, anticipation mingled with a lingering sense of trepidation. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rustling ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The once vibrant symphony of nature now seemed muted, as if holding its breath in anticipation. I scanned the darkness, searching for any signs of movement, my heart thudding against my chest. Slowly, I retraced my steps back to the warmth and safety of our campfire haven, my senses on high alert. Returning to my family, I wore a reassuring smile, hoping to convey a sense of calm despite the lingering mystery. "It's all right," I assured them, my voice infused with a newfound conviction. Whatever it was, it must have moved along. "We're safe here." Relief washed over their faces, their tense postures gradually easing. We settled back into our makeshift sanctuary, the familiarity of the crackling fire offering a comforting embrace. Our senses remained heightened, vigilant for any lingering signs of the unseen visitor. Just as a semblance of calm began to settle over our campsite, an otherworldly roar pierced the night air, tearing through the fabric of serenity. The sound, far from the natural symphony we had grown accustomed to, possessed a menacing quality that resonated deep within our souls. Its metallic timbre reverberated through the darkness, sending icy tendrils of fear snaking down our spines. Amelia's eyes widened in terror, her small frame trembling with the weight of the unknown. Emma's expression mirrored the trepidation etched across our faces. This was no ordinary sound, a realization that hung heavy in the air. That doesn't sound like a deer or a boar," Emma stammered, her voice quivering with a mix of disbelief and dread. "What could it possibly be?" Before we could ponder further, the deafening roar reverberated through the night once more, closer this time. Its proximity shattered any illusions of safety that had momentarily settled over us. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an electric sense of urgency. Our instincts kicked into overdrive, urging us to abandon our belongings and seek shelter. "Leave everything," I shouted, my voice laced with urgency. "We have to get to the RV now." Without a moment's hesitation, we sprang into action. Emma snatched Amelia's hand, her grip tight and resolute, while I scooped up our precious daughter into my arms. "My bear," she screamed and picked up her new toy. Her tiny hands clung to the worn bear with an intensity that belied her tender age. The campfire, once a symbol of warmth and tranquility, was abandoned in an instant as we sprinted toward the sanctuary of the RV. The world around us blurred into a frenzy of motion as our legs carried us with desperate urgency. Fear propelled us forward, fueling our determination to reach safety. With each pounding heartbeat, the roar grew louder, its ominous resonance seemingly at our heels, a predator closing in on its prey. Finally, we reached the welcoming embrace of the RV, its sturdy frame offering a semblance of refuge from the unknown terror that lurked beyond. I swiftly deposited Amelia onto the seat, her wide eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and relief that mirrored our own. As I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and anxiety, I spared a glance back at the abandoned campsite. The darkness swallowed our belongings, the remnants of our interrupted evening left behind as a haunting reminder of the inexplicable menace that had disrupted our peaceful retreat. With a trembling hand, I inserted the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life in harmony with the echoes of the unknown creature outside. The RV became our fortress, its metal walls shielding us from the terrors that lurked beyond. As we peeled away from the once idyllic campsite, the wailing roar echoed in the distance. Our hearts raced in unison, our breaths coming in jagged gasps as we sought solace in the sanctuary of the rolling vehicle. With a trembling hand gripping the steering wheel, I pressed my foot down harder on the gas pedal, urging the RV to accelerate. The vehicle responded with a surge of power, propelling us forward with a newfound urgency. The engine roared in unison with the thundering beat of my heart, creating a symphony of adrenaline-fueled chaos. As the wheels churned beneath us, the surrounding trees became a blur of green and brown, their branches reaching out like ghostly specters in our wake. The world outside the windows shifted in a dizzying dance, a kaleidoscope of fleeting glimpses and fleeting shadows. The headlights sliced through the darkness, casting elongated shadows that flickered and danced upon the passing foliage. Each passing plant and tree seemed to contort and twist in the ethereal glow, their distorted forms morphing into grotesque silhouettes of their former selves. A heavy silence settled within the RV, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic whoosh of the rushing wind. Our breaths remained caught in our chests, suspended in a shared state of shock and disbelief. The weight of what we had witnessed hung in the air, a chilling reminder that the boundaries of our world were not as fixed as we had once believed. The scene we had left behind in the forest haunted our thoughts, a glimpse into a realm far removed from our own, something demonic, something that defied explanation. The image of that otherworldly roar and the malevolent presence it implied lingered like a scar etched into our memories, forever imprinted upon our souls. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours as we raced along the winding road, each passing second feeling like an eternity. Our collective relief remained just out of reach, overshadowed by the lingering unease that clung to us like a specter. The distance between the forest and the main road seemed interminable, every curve and bend in the road prolonging our escape. Finally, the familiar sight of the main road materialized before us, a beacon of respite in the darkness. As the RV merged onto its paved embrace, a collective sigh of relief cascaded through the cabin. The weight that had burdened our shoulders began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of safety and security. Yet, despite the relief that washed over us, the memory of the demonic encounter refused to dissipate as we were heading home. We knew that what we had witnessed in the depths of the forest would forever remain a haunting enigma, a testament to the boundless mysteries that lurk on the fringes of our understanding. With weary bodies and restless minds, we arrived back at the familiar sanctuary of our home. The weight of the night's harrowing encounter clung to us like a heavy shroud, making the simple act of finding solace in sleep an arduous task. We all slept in the same bed that night. Tossing and turning beneath the covers, we battled against the remnants of fear that lingered within the recesses of our thoughts. Morning finally broke through the darkness, casting its tentative rays of light upon our weary faces. The sun's gentle warmth filtered through the curtains, offering a glimmer of respite from the lingering shadows of the night. We emerged from our sleep-deprived haze, grateful for the sanctuary that our home provided. Gathering around the breakfast table, our shared silence spoke volumes. We sought solace in the simple act of breaking bread together, a familiar routine that offered a semblance of normalcy amidst the lingering unease. No words were spoken of the night's horrors. Instead, we focused on the mundane tasks of the morning, the clinking of cutlery and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee serving as a comforting backdrop to our collective attempt at healing. As the day unfolded, we busied ourselves with the routine tasks, finding solace in the familiar rhythms. Dusting shelves, tending to neglected plants, and tidying up the remnants of the night's chaos became acts of therapy, a means of grounding ourselves in the reassuring normalcy of domesticity. The weight of exhaustion settled upon our shoulders, and we allowed ourselves moments of respite as the day wore on. Sunday, a day of rest, offered a reprieve. We retreated to the cozy corners of our home, seeking solace in the embrace of soft couches and plush pillows. As the hours slipped away, a quiet calm enveloped our home. The once turbulent waves of fear and uncertainty settled into a gentle ebb and flow. Laughter and conversation began to permeate the air, intermingling with the familiar sounds of a household in motion. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the living room window, we settled down in front of the TV, seeking solace in laughter and lightheartedness. I reached for the remote control, ready to immerse ourselves in the comedic world of a streaming service, when something caught our attention. The TV screen flickered to life, displaying the urgent and captivating headlines of the news. A mixture of curiosity and a tinge of apprehension filled the room, prompting me to pause and leave the news channel playing. The news anchor's voice echoed through the room, delivering the shocking report of a missing family. My wife leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the TV, her voice trembling with concern. Amelia, her eyes wide with curiosity, leaned closer to the TV, her teddy bear still clutched tightly in her arms as she was listening to the newsreader. This is a breaking news update on a harrowing incident that has shaken the community to its core. The Hudson family, who embarked on a seemingly routine hiking trip into the serene depths of the nearby forest several weeks ago, has tragically met a devastating fate. Today, authorities have confirmed the discovery and identification of their camper van and remains, a discovery that has left investigators, medical examiners, and locals alike in a state of shock and disbelief. The process of identifying the bodies was nothing short of a nightmare for the dedicated team of forensic experts. The unimaginable horror that unfolded in those woods rendered their task exceptionally challenging. Their bodies, torn apart by an unknown and unimaginable force, presented investigators with an enigma that defied explanation. Their positions were grotesquely twisted, their injuries inexplicable and mind-boggling. According to the investigators, an unknown force seriously damaged their RV as well. Medical examiners, renowned for their expertise, were left dumbfounded as they grappled with the mysterious circumstances surrounding this tragic event. The sheer brutality of their demise left them searching for answers that seemed to lie just beyond their reach. The bite marks, enormous in size and ferocity, left on the bodies only added to the perplexity of the situation. Astonishingly, DNA testing revealed that these bite marks belonged to an unidentified creature, sending shockwaves of fear and disbelief through the community. The repercussions of this shocking revelation have reverberated throughout the town, leaving residents on edge and gripped by a pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty. The once serene forest, a place of solace and tranquility, now holds untold horrors that have shattered the peace and shattered the lives of the Hudson family. Authorities advise everyone not to go into the forest until they find out what happened and what killed the family. As the newsreader went on, we all stopped eating our popcorn. In light of these disturbing developments, it is my duty to advise against venturing into the forest at this time. The safety and security that once accompanied our tranquil natural surroundings have been shattered, replaced by an aura of uncertainty and fear. Folks, we cannot ignore the evidence before us, the evidence that points to an unknown and terrifying presence within those woods. I understand the allure of nature's embrace, the desire to explore, to seek solace, and to reconnect with the world around us. However, in this moment, I implore you to prioritize your safety and exercise caution. The risk is simply too great, and the consequences too dire to ignore. I urge you to remain vigilant, to report any suspicious activities or unusual occurrences to the authorities immediately. Your eyes and ears are our greatest assets in keeping our town safe. Together, we can overcome this darkness and restore a sense of security to our beloved community. In the coming days and weeks, We will keep you updated on the progress of our investigations, the country sheriff said to the reporter. According to the ancient tales of our indigenous tribes, the newsreader's voice reverberated with a solemn tone. The depths of this forest are said to be haunted by a sinister entity known as the Black Beast. As the words hung heavy in the air, the camera panned over the tranquil landscape, capturing the rustic charm of a small Indian village nestled amidst the wilderness. Suddenly, the screen flickered to life, revealing the weathered visage of an elderly Indian man, his eyes bearing the weight of centuries-old wisdom. The Black Beast, the elder's voice resonated with a mixture of reverence and dread, has cast its shadow over these lands for generations. His weathered hands gestured emphatically as he spoke, as if summoning forth the very essence of the creature from the depths of memory. It is a creature of terror, a spectre that prowls the heart of the forest, its presence a harbinger of doom. The camera zoomed in, capturing every line etched upon the elder's face, each wrinkle a testament to the trials endured under the watchful gaze of the Black Beast. We know not how it selects its victims, he continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resignation, nor why it chooses to spare some while condemning others to a fate worse than death. The picture went back to the studio again. As you have heard, these are just local legends, of course. We will continue to bring you updates on this developing story as more information becomes available. Our hearts go out to the Hudson family and all those affected by this unimaginable tragedy. Please stay tuned for further updates as we strive to unravel the mysteries that lie hidden within the depths of our world, the newsreader said, and they showed some photos of the Hudson family. The images on the screen showed their smiling faces, frozen in time. The thought that the camper van I saw in the forest was the crime scene of a brutal and unexplained murder not far from our camp sent chills down on my spine. This was something I kept to myself. But we all thought about the same thing. The next ones could have been us. Third story. How to survive camping. Blood forcibly taken. I run a private campground. Though it felt like I wouldn't for much longer, considering how badly things went last week. At least the risks we took have given us some insight on the man with no shadows plan. He intends to replace me with someone that, presumably, is easier to control. What he wants to do with that influence I am not certain of, but you know what? I don't care. I'm sure it won't be anything good and I am not going to let him win. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning. The old sheriff came up with a plan to kill the Knott brother. He sent it to me via text so that he wouldn't be seen at my house too much and so he couldn't be overheard on the phone. He doesn't trust hardly anyone right now, which I think is prudent. This is one advantage we have over the man with no shadow, technology. For the first step, we needed to convince the man with no shadow that he had me cornered. That I was too afraid to leave my campground and that my fear was causing me to drive people away. The concussion had already helped with that, as I was still largely confined to my home and was relying on the old sheriff and Brian to bring me things I needed, like groceries. The sheriff's idea was to stage a highly visible blow-up at one of my staff. Yell at them over something trivial. Make it look like I was stressed to the point that any little thing would set off a collapse. I was still considering which staff member to target, who would be the most resilient to being unexpectedly yelled at, when my brother came over to check on how I was doing. It wasn't an intentional change of plans. It just, sort of happened. I don't like making our internal drama public. Due to the nature of what we do around here, we tend to keep our problems to ourselves, and we certainly don't involve outsiders. But I've told you some personal things already, and maybe it's only fair that I tell you this as well, no matter how ashamed I am. I accused my brother of being the black sheep. The one distributing the flyers. Stupid, I know, but I wasn't thinking straight, or maybe it was the pain meds. We finally got some that were safe from another town. Anyway, the comment that the man with no shadows proxy had made was eating at me, how he insinuated my brother would be willing to sell the campground. I was feeling a little testy when he visited, not at him, just at the situation in general, but he wound up being the person I blew up at and things escalated and I made the accusation. I wasn't even pretending to be angry. It hurt him pretty bad, I think. Of course it would. Your own sister saying that you're behind stirring up the town to the point it's trying to kill her. Yeah. I fucked up. There were a couple other incidents we orchestrated, nice and visible, to demonstrate that perhaps Kate wasn't keeping it together after all. The old sheriff was convinced that I was being watched, the man with no shadow would be a fool not to, and so after a few more meltdowns we could be confident that word had gotten back to him. One of those scenes was at the old sheriff, and after we staged that fight Brian took over running errands for me. I wasn't as confident in our plan as the old sheriff was. There was one additional assurance that I wanted. I didn't tell him what I planned to do. He would deem it too risky. He might have tried to stop me. We would have fought for real, if that happened. I will sometimes listen to suggestions, but I do not take kindly to being told what to do. I went to see the man with no shadow. A significant risk, especially after he tried to kill me with the car accident. I admit that I was afraid. The only reason I tried was because I believed that killing me meant that he'd have to convince my brother to sell instead. I guess I don't actually believe he's the black sheep. It's just my brother's resolve is an unknown quality, even to me. If the man with no shadow thought I was on the edge of collapse, then leaving me alive would be the fastest and easiest route to what he wanted. The weather was mild that day, so I wore a shirt with a low collar so that the discoloration on my neck was clearly visible. It's purple and yellow with spots of magenta red, blotches that cover the entirety of one side of my neck, down onto my collarbones, with lingering patches on my jaw. The blood under my skin is slowly dispersing, traveling down my body from the pull of gravity. It's tender but it doesn't hurt like it did. The swelling has come down immensely. I skipped my pain meds that morning. The less acting I had to do, the better. Then I took my shotgun and went out into the woods. I went to the grove where the man with no shadow lives. He watched me approach, sitting on a large stone, one bare foot tucked up close to his body, the other stretched out to touch the grass. He conspicuously eyed my gun a moment and then lazily glanced up to meet my gaze. "Fancy another try at me?" he asked. Good timing, I was feeling peckish. He dropped his eyes down to the shadow at my feet and slowly smiled. "I'm here to negotiate," I replied. I dredged up the memory of the pain of having my shadow torn apart. How I'd collapsed, screaming. I let my voice tremble. His smile deepened. "You want off this land," I continued. "I'll release you if you promise to leave. And to take the Knot brother with you." The man with no shadow laughed. "Kate," he sighed, hopping off the stone. "Oh, Kate. I thought you were smarter than this." He walked towards me. I hoisted my shotgun, letting my hands shake, and he hesitated only briefly at the edge of his grove. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped out of his territory and continued to advance towards me. I pointed the gun at him and he paused, barely a foot away from the barrel. "That's not what I want," he murmured. Then he jerked a hand up, so quickly I might not have been able to react if I weren't expecting it. It was an effort to not squeeze the trigger. I almost did. My hand twitched reflexively, but I fought the urge down and let him grab the gun and rip it out of my hands. He tossed it aside onto the forest floor. I cried out in surprise and stepped backwards, but he wasn't letting me escape. He lunged forwards, grabbed the front of my shirt, twisting the fabric between his fingers, and he pulled me close. I was forced to tilt my head back to look up into his eyes, and the bruises on my neck were clearly visible. He traced them, with one finger of his free hand, and I did not have to pretend as I trembled in fear. "Or maybe you're not being stupid," he said, his finger stopping just at the edge of the cut across my lower lip. "Maybe you're desperate. The Knot brother almost killed me," I whispered. Is that the closest you've come to dying? Poor thing. Humans aren't really cut out for this sort of thing. Wouldn't it be a relief to let it all go? Is your family's legacy worth this? He gently brushed a lock of my hair behind my ear, the tenderness of the gesture offset by how tightly he still held my shirt, pinning me in place. I shuddered and he seemed pleased by my reaction. I have some authority over the Knot brother, he said, studying my face. I dropped my head and avoided eye contact. I can tell him to stop trying to kill you. Give you a little peace in which to make your decision. But Kate, he is my subordinate, not my slave. Wait too long and I may not be able to restrain him entirely, nor the town. They won't kill you, but neither will they leave you intact. The threat was not unexpected. Even though I'd mentally prepared myself for this, on the walk to the grove, I still felt sick hearing the words and understanding their full implication. My words stuck in my throat and I was unable to reply. The man with no shadow took this to mean I was truly cowed, and perhaps in that moment I was, and said that he would tell the Knot brother to spare my life. As a gesture of kindness. He didn't actually want me dead, after all. That wasn't necessary. It all sounded very convincing, and I think without the lady's tea, I would have believed every word. I still don't understand why you want to destroy my campground, I said, finally finding my voice again. You don't have to understand. You just have to do what I want. He smiled broadly and patted me on the cheek. Then he let go of my shirt and briskly walked away, casually putting his back to me. I eyed the distance between myself and the shotgun. I admit it was very tempting. I wasn't sure I wanted to gamble all of this on having better reflexes than him, though. This was a good talk, he called back to me. It was nice to have an actual conversation for once. Maybe I'll visit the lady in the woods and give her my thanks for supplying you with the tea. And then I'll kill her, of course. He laughed. That was enough for me. I couldn't stay any longer. I scooped up the shotgun and turned to leave, walking quickly, eager to put the sound of his laughter behind me. And then a town hall meeting was called, just as I expected. I'm starting to think that the Knot brother is actually not that clever on its own, and the man with no shadow is the real brains of the operation here. After all, it tried to integrate itself with my campground directly first, thereby putting it in close proximity to the people most familiar with monsters. Though if a commenter hadn't pointed out the discrepancies, I wonder if it would have succeeded, regardless, for how easily it seems to have taken over the town. I feel it would have had more luck with, whatever its goals are, by starting there. The rally had stirred up the town enough to ensure a good turnout at the meeting. It was likely that almost everyone would be there. All the Knot brother had to do was go out in front of them and introduce himself, and they would all be his. Everyone in town that was undecided or still on my side, they would be his. Unless, of course, someone killed him. What a shame that would be. Since I was without a car, the plan was that Brian would pick me up shortly before the meeting was scheduled to start. The old sheriff was already in position. I'm not sure what it says about him that he knows how to get a good angle on the town hall with a scoped rifle, but I'm glad he's on our side. I was armed with the pistol and shotgun. Certainly, they hadn't done a whole lot to the Knot brother the first time, but I only needed to make a symbolic gesture. There was a knock at my door as I sat waiting. Startled, I grabbed my shotgun and hurried to answer, surprised that I hadn't heard Brian's truck pull up. The man with the skull cup was on my doorstep. This is a bad time, I finally said after a long moment of awkward silence. Can we talk about that kiss some other day? What makes you think I came here to talk about that? Perhaps I am here because of how you tried to refuse my offer of a drink. I froze, like every muscle in my body was shot through with ice, locked up in terror. Some part of my brain gibbered that I was going to die horribly, and while I heard what he said next, I didn't register the words. Not until he said my name to get my attention and repeated himself. He wasn't going to kill me, not after all he'd done to keep me alive. But I would have to atone for my mistakes, and there had been many as of late. He sighed and traced the rim of the cup with one finger, his eyes half closed. "I told you not to empty the cup," he murmured. "It is easy enough to refill when it runs low. Refilling it when it is emptied is another matter. I honestly would have preferred you have returned it empty and let me refill it, as I could have managed it properly. But what's done is done, and now you need to finish what you started." His voice sounded weary, and this time, it wasn't the condescending exhaustion he adopted when I was, in his opinion, being dense. I peered at him intently, noting how stark his cheekbones were and the shadows under his eyes. He looked, gaunt, pale, like he's sick. Did I do this to him? He looked me dead in the eyes, and with a flat, emotionless stare that never wavered from my face, he turned the cup sideways until the liquid spilled out and puddled on the porch. He tilted the cup upright before the last few drops fell. Blood from what was already there. Then he lifted his hand to his mouth and bit carefully down on a knuckle. The skin split open and brilliant drops of blood beaded up. He tipped his hand so that they collected together and spilled out and into the cup. Blood freely given. The man with the skull cup handed it to me, along with his knife. "Blood of an enemy, forcibly taken," he said. "Don't screw it up this time. I had the right idea but the wrong source. The sheriff was never my enemy, but the Knott brother sure as hell is." I called up the old sheriff and told him there was a change in the plan. He didn't like it, but grudgingly agreed. "The town isn't going to like how you're handling this," he said. "My family isn't here to be their friends," I replied. "We're here to protect them." And then Brian was there, the back of his pickup truck loaded with large dogs, and I climbed into the passenger side and buckled myself in. He asked where my gun was, and I told him about the change in plans. "This is going to be messy," he sighed, backing the car out of the driveway. "I can't promise the dogs won't help." Messy was fine. Maybe a veritable bloodbath would remind the town exactly what they were dealing with. Both what my campground was, and what I was. Yes, I'm trying to save people now instead of letting them suffer the consequences of their choices, but that doesn't mean they can just forget that I'm willing to slit my share of throats. I hate the sight of the town hall, after my uncle's death. My heart sped up as Brian parked within eyeshot of the building. I took a shallow breath and let it out slowly, trying to calm myself, and then gave up on that. Screw it. I didn't need to be calm. I needed to be angry. Anger had carried me through every hard thing I'd done, whether it was just or not, and it would carry me through this as well. I slammed the door of the pickup truck behind me. The dogs watched me go, lined up at the edge of the pickup's bed with their tongues hanging out. I walked alone to the closed doors of the town hall, took a breath, and then shouldered them bodily open. Kicking them open would have made a more impressive entrance, sure, but I didn't want to risk spilling the contents of the cup I carried. The Knott brother stood behind the podium at the fore of the room. Beside him was the buyer. My unwitting cousin looked nervous, his eyes wide and his forehead shining with sweat. He seemed ready to bolt at any moment, and for a brief second he looked relieved for the interruption. Then he saw the knife in my hand and he went pale. Opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to yell for someone to call the police, and then that died when he realized that no one else was moving, like this was normal. Maybe it is, around here. I don't think he's under the control of the man with no shadow. It's a hunch, but I feel pretty good about it. He looked too afraid there, standing at the front of the room and realizing that someone was bearing down on them with murder in her eyes and not a soul was lifting a finger to stop me. I stopped halfway to the Knott brother, who had not moved from the podium. He stared at me in shock. Clearly our gamble had paid off, for he did not expect me to be here. I raised the knife and pointed the tip at him. "That is not your friend," I said in a clear voice that carried easily throughout the room. "That is an abomination. Not much different from all the other monsters that I keep trapped on my land so that you all can sleep safely in your beds at night. Kate, the Knott brother sighed. Didn't you get a concussion recently? Maybe you should see your doctor about these outbursts you've been having lately. Is your brother speaking to you again yet? The old sheriff had picked up some things during his tenure. Things about surveillance. And he'd wired up the podium so that he could listen in to what was being said while he was in his sniper position. At the moment when the Knott brother paused, before anyone in the room could react, a bullet came through the window and into the side of the Knott brother's head. The force of it knocked him over. My cousin, the buyer, shrieked and threw himself to the ground. The rest of the room stirred, some stood, and the police that were present to maintain general order put their hands on their guns, their attention fixed on where I stood waiting. Then everyone went still and silent again as the Knott brother slowly picked himself up. See? Stupid. He could have just played dead long enough for the police to escort me out. But now, they all saw him for what he was. Fine, he snarled, blood dripping down from the bullet hole in the side of his head. Fine. This plan was annoying, anyways. I don't like being around humans. I don't like pretending to be your friend. I just want to feed. He knocked the podium aside with one sweep of his arm. It smashed sideways to the floor. People were on their feet now, someone screamed, and they bolted to the edges of the room, crowding near the walls, desperate to get away from the creature that was stalking down the aisle to where I stood. His empty abdomen stretched wide, ribs dripping with fluid, and I saw raw hunger in his eyes. I felt elated. They saw him for what he was. And it didn't matter. He called to them and they came, turning over chairs in their haste, eyes maddened and empty. I saw the intention in their mindless stares as they rolled across the room in a wave of human flesh. They would tear me apart and feed me to their master, whose words poisoned their minds and overrode their senses and turned them into monsters. I've dealt with plenty of monsters on my land. We have a simple strategy. Guns and dogs. And Brian's hounds came in through the door, throwing them fully open with the impact of their body weight, and they rolled past me in a black, angry pack of fur and fangs. They hit the line of people closing in on me, a heavy collision of muscle and fur into flesh, and they all went down, a veritable barricade of flailing and fighting. There were screams. I couldn't tell if it was rage or pain, for the dogs had cleared a pathway between me and the Knott brother, and I was running forwards. They'd stopped the mob just short of the aisle. The Knott brother ran to meet me, arms spread low to his side, ready to pull me into the void of his abdomen. I gripped the knife tight. And just before we collided, the old sheriff took his second shot, and the Knott brother's knee exploded into red ruin. The knife went up and into his chin as he fell. He landed hard in front of me, his body held up by one knee and the strength of my arm, his head twisted back as he dangled from the blade, gurgling as blood flooded his mouth and throat. The room went quiet. Even the people that were on the ground, pinned under the weight of the dogs, subsided into muffled whimpering. They stopped trying to get to me. They just stared, wide-eyed, breathing fast, and anything they might have said to one another was drowned out by the desperate choking of the Knott brother. Then that, too, went quiet, replaced by the steady drip of blood onto the wooden floor. I held the cup under the wound until it was full. Blood of my enemy, forcibly taken. Then I ripped the knife free and let his body fall to the ground. And I left. Behind me, the dogs turned their attention to the corpse. They savaged it, ripping into it and tearing the skin from muscle, severing tendons, pulling the bones free. Someone was quietly sick in the corner of the room. I didn't care. They'd made a deal with the devil. They shouldn't be surprised by the results. I'm a campground manager. I'm not very clever and there's a lot going on that I don't understand. I think the man with no shadow has underestimated me, however. He only trusts what he can control, and this leads him to use people as tools and then to discard them as soon as they aren't useful. I wonder if the Knot brother realized this, or if he thought he could stay useful for as long as it took to get what the man with no shadow had promised him. The campground as his own personal hunting grounds, no doubt, once it was no longer in my possession. I wonder if the man with no shadow would have betrayed him before that happened. I guess it doesn't matter now. I trust the old sheriff. I trust Brian. And though I question his motives, I trust that the man with the skull cup will help to keep me alive. I returned his knife and cup. He took them and then raised the cup to his lips and drank. Then he nodded at me, faintly, and walked away. So I guess I did it right this time, and I guess he's going to be okay. I don't think I'll be able to trick the man with no shadow again. He'll be wise to it now, realizing that I'm not such a simple creature, that I, too, am capable of deceit. I'm okay with this. I'm not interested in playing his game. I'm bad at it. We're going to play my game instead, and that game is just good old-fashioned violence. The family specialty. Fourth story. How to Survive Camping, a Very Old War. Series. I said I had more to tell you. This is it. I must warn you again that I have some upsetting things to tell you about in regards to animals. If it bothers you when animals are harmed for any reason, please be careful about reading further. Everything came apart not long after I posted about the fairy being wounded. It was late evening. I was staying near my house as I didn't want to be in the deep woods until I knew more about the fairy's condition. There was no indication that anything was wrong. Not until I heard the baying of dogs. I leapt from my desk and moved as quickly as I could, grabbing shotgun, knife, and jacket before bolting out the door. I ran across the yard, struggling in the deep snow, in the direction of the noise. Not far. They weren't in the deep woods, at least. My breath steamed in the cold air. The lead dancer waited at the edge of the woods. Bo was with her. I didn't stop for them, just kept jogging towards the commotion, and they followed. Neither had to run. Somehow, they kept pace with me merely by walking. I hated them a little bit for it. The Fomorian has been hunting the fairy since their last encounter, the lead dancer told me. I've had the musicians tailing it. It knew they were there, but it didn't care anymore. It's been entirely focused on the fairy. It's even ignored me, Bo added. Spring is coming, I gasped, my lungs aching from the cold air. It's running out of time. The fairy is injured as well, the dancer added. They can't win this. I know. That's why I'm going to help. The lead dancer's expression was flat and cold. You're going to die too, she said. Like hell I will. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Bo's hand snapped out and seized her wrist. The pair stopped walking, and I slowed only enough to look over my shoulder in surprise. The two stared at each other, the dancer's eyes wide with muted anger, locked with Bo's own stern, narrow-eyed glare. Let her go, he said. What can a human possibly do against a Fomorian? I don't know, but we're going to find out. He turned to look at me. He nodded slightly. That was the closest I was going to get to encouragement from him. I nodded back and kept going. Neither of them followed me. I was on my own from here out. It felt right. Hasn't it always been this way? Just me up against the darkness. I've had help, here and there, but at the end of the day I've faced my foe alone. I killed the master of the vanishing house. I abandoned the man with no shadow to wander forever in the body of the thing in the dark. And I freed the lady in chains and then killed the lady with extra eyes. But what exactly was I going to do against a Fomorian? I slowed to a halt as soon as I could see the battle through the trees. The area had been cleared by the struggle, trees uprooted and thrown aside or blasted into splinters by the force of the blows that were exchanged. It'd be hell to clean up later, I thought dully. At least I'd get a lot of firewood out of it. If I lived long enough to use it. In the middle knelt the fairy. Red blood bloomed on the mudded snow around them like spring flowers. One knee was against the ground, they rested one arm on the other. In their hand was clenched their boar spear. They were breathing heavily, their gaze fixed on the Fomorian. It paced back and forth, dragging its twisted leg through the snow, its limp even more pronounced. It held no weapon, but its hands were curled into fists like clubs. Its hood had fallen back to reveal thin, matted hair like rope. Its face was humanoid in that it had eyes and a nose and a mouth, but the flesh ran like wax. It formed whirls and valleys, layers of skin stacked upon each other like the edge of a book. It wasn't from some injury. This was simply how it was. One of its eyes was missing. The flesh surrounding the empty eye socket was gone as well, leaving behind a gaping wound that seeped black blood and watery bile. Its other eye glowed with red light. Between the two combatants stood the dogs. They formed a line, heads held proudly, and their coats were black even in the bright sunlight. They were the only thing holding the Fomorian back from finishing off the fairy. Not that it would do any good, I realized. The fairy didn't seem capable of standing on their own power at the moment. All the Fomorian had to do was wait until they bled out, and it seemed intent on doing just that. I glanced around. Where was its deer? Surely it could ride to safety. It wasn't far. It stood locked in combat with the dapple-grey stallion just past the edge of the shattered trees. The horse's reins were gripped tight in the deer's mouth, preventing it from circling around the deer and attacking from another angle. Its head was lowered, putting its antlers between it and the horse. And the horse was snapping at it, stretching its neck out, trying to get past the barrier of those sharpened points to sink its teeth into the soft flesh of the deer's head. Well, here was something I could help with. The horse hated me. I could see the wound I left in its neck, thickly scabbed over and glistening with fresh blood in the cracks. I stayed on the edge of the clearing, climbing over fallen trees to reach where the deer and the stallion battled. The stallion saw me as I approached. It lunged forwards, its attention no longer on the deer, and the deer turned and dug in its hooves, holding fast to the horse's bridle. The stallion stomped in anger, baring its teeth with a screech, and continued to struggle to escape the deer's grasp. It very obviously wanted to stomp me into a paste more than it wanted to rip the deer's throat out. I clambered up one of the trunks that had fallen at an angle, getting enough height to grab a sturdy tree branch. I hauled myself up on it and then pulled myself up a few more for good measure. The dapple-grey stallion watched with malice in its eyes, breath steaming heavily in the cold air. "Okay, let go now," I called down to the deer. "Go help your master. I'll deal with the overgrown pony." It didn't seem to like being called that. It lunged again, and this time, the deer let go of the reins. Now freed, the horse came directly after me. Its hooves struck sparks as it ran, and it jumped up on the tree trunk I'd used to boost myself into the upper branches. The trunk snapped, long splinters erupting from the broken ends as the horse's weight drove straight through the wood. It whinnied in thwarted rage and then turned and reared, slamming both back hooves against the tree I'd taken refuge in. It jerked violently, and I clung desperately to the trunk, struggling to maintain my balance. The horse readied itself for another blow. But in the clearing, the deer was kneeling by the fairy's side. They wrapped an arm around its neck and pulled themselves onto its back. The Fomorian moved to stop it, but the dogs were quick to intercept, swarming around the Fomorian and snapping at its good leg. It batted at them and they darted away, only to reconverge as soon as it took another step towards the fairy. The dogs gave the deer time to rise with its stricken rider. It bounded away, slipping between the trees and carrying the fairy away from the Fomorian's grasp. It screamed with rage at the realization that its prey was getting away. It screeched something in a language I didn't recognize, a phrase so vile that my stomach clenched with nausea that almost made me faint upon hearing it. The horse snapped its head around and then the rest of its body followed, abandoning me to leap to its master's call. No. It couldn't. It couldn't catch up to the wounded fairy. I clutched my knife tight and began to descend. The back leg. I could slash the tendon. Surely, I could do that much. I dropped hastily from the tree, letting go of the branch before I should. I hit the ground hard and might have hurt myself if it weren't for the mounds of snow to catch me. The Fomorian had hold of the horse's bridle. No. It couldn't catch up. The fairy was my campground's only hope. I pulled my knife from its sheath. Brian's dogs beat me there. They swarmed the horse, biting at its legs. It kicked at them in return and one of its hooves connected, throwing a dog violently towards the trees. It lay there a moment, then sluggishly heaved itself to its feet. My mouth was dry with fear. No. They couldn't do this. All this time they'd focused on staying between the fairy and the Fomorian, because the latter knew it was too costly to engage. But with the fairy wounded and victory within grasp, the Fomorian was willing to make whatever sacrifices it had to, including the horse. Another dog latched on to its hind leg. It threw it off, but the damage was already done. Bloody bone showed through the tattered remains of flesh. The Fomorian kicked at the horse's sides and the beleaguered animal bolted, struggling to stay abreast of the pursuing hounds. They nipped at its legs as it ran, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they took it down. How many dogs would be lost in the process? And what happened when the Fomorian joined the fray? I wiped my face with the back of my hand, holding back tears. What the hell was I going to tell Brian? I stumbled through the woods, back to where the dancer and Bo waited for me. The dancer looked anxious and Bo was strained. His grip was tight around his cup, his knuckles white with tension. "We need to get back to the house," Bo said tersely. "Quickly." "What's wrong?" I asked. "Sun is about to set. We don't want to be in the forest after dark." I glanced at the sky. We weren't going to make it. There was no way I could run that far and that fast. "What happens after dark?" I asked, trudging through the snow to where they waited impatiently. "Night belongs to evil things. You know this," the dancer chided. "The Fomorian. And it would surely employ every power it had in an attempt to kill the fairy. If it could not, it might turn on us, to vent its frustration or perhaps to lure the fairy out with our cries for help. Either way, it would not be a quick death. I told them I couldn't make it that far in time. Frantically, I thought about alternatives. Perhaps we could find the house that belonged to the lady with extra eyes. The spiders seemed to be on our side, after all. Perhaps they'd give us refuge. I couldn't think of anything else. The dancer and Bo glanced at each other. The dancer said something, I couldn't make out her words, and Bo nodded curtly. He swept out an arm and caught me in the midsection. It knocked the air out of me and I froze on reflex as I was snatched up, my feet no longer touching solid ground, and then there was a bony shoulder digging into my stomach. Bo had thrown me over his shoulder. My arms dangled down his back and I grabbed hold of his hoodie as he began to run. He didn't leave footprints, I realized. Neither did the dancer. They ran on top of the snow as if it weren't there, and freed from this constraint, they both could move a lot faster than I could. And, if Bo's even breathing was any indication, they didn't get winded like a human would. It helps to have inhuman friends sometimes. I watched as the forest darkened behind us. It didn't feel right. The forest grew dark early because of the canopy, but this was winter. The branches were bare, and the snow seemed to be moving. I watched in horror as a rotted vine burst from beneath the snow. It unfurled, rapidly growing in height, and vicious thorns sprouted from the blackened branch. More vines joined it. The thorns sprouted from everywhere, wrapping around the trees, choking the underbrush, and snatching at Bo's ankles. He hissed in pain but did not slow his stride. Has it always been able to do this? I shouted at the dancer. It is expending everything it has to kill the fairy, she replied. If we survive until dawn, it will be weakened enough that we might just be able to finish it off ourselves. We reached the field as the sun teetered on the edge of the horizon. I stared into the woods, watching with despair as the thorns consumed my forest. They grew close enough together that they could easily converge on anything they wished to hold fast, imprisoning the victim much as Brian had been imprisoned. My heart sank and I desperately hoped that the deer had at least gotten the fairy out of the woods in time. As for everything else in there, well, it seemed they were all in for a bad night. Bo set me down on the threshold of my house. I hastily unlocked the door, my hands shaking. I threw it open and hurriedly tumbled inside, inviting both Bo and the dancer to follow me. They calmly stepped through the doorway and I slammed it shut and then locked it again, trembling with nervousness. "Kate," a voice called from inside the house. "Brian." He sounded frightened. "What are you doing here?" I asked as he came into the entryway. I had a bad feeling. And then, he gestured helplessly at the living room. So I let myself inside. Had I given him a key? I must have given him a key. The hazards of your office also being in your house and having employees that sometimes need to get into the records. There were more important things to worry about, though. I walked past him to see what was in the living room. The fairy lay on my couch. Brian had spread out some towels underneath them to soak up the blood. Their armor lay strewn on the floor and their clothing was pulled away from the ugly wound across their torso. I could see a pink shine from where it crossed their stomach and realized how close they'd come to being disemboweled. A first aid kit sat on the coffee table. "You're going to want the good kit," I said grimly. I went to the closet and brought out the kit my parents had assembled and that I'd kept stocked over the years. I shoved this at Brian. "Do you know how to sew stitches?" I asked. He shook his head, so I went to the office and came back with my laptop. I set it up on the coffee table so that he could reference it while kneeling next to the wounded fairy. "You can find anything on YouTube," I told him. "Figure it out. Where's the deer?" Hopefully leading the Fomorian astray. I don't know how long that'll last though. Not long, I thought. The forest was inaccessible and the field would give the Fomorian a clear line of sight on it. Once it realized the fairy was no longer riding the deer, it would come here. "Then I'm going to go figure out how we can survive this," I muttered. I checked the front window to see if the thorns were getting any closer. They'd stopped at the border of the forest, to my great relief. There was something coming up out of the woods, but there were two of them and they were too small to be the Fomorian. Their eyes glowed in the descending darkness. Brian's dogs. Only two of them. I felt sick to my stomach. Where were the rest? Brian had 6 dogs. I watched as they wearily made their way up the field towards the house. My intention was to open the door once they were on the patio, but the dogs did not come that far. They stopped at the gate. Stopped, turned, and sat down, staring off into the night. Guarding the house. There was no point trying to coerce them to come inside. The dogs had a duty to perform. Protect their master and protect the fairy. I reluctantly stepped away from the front door and returned to the interior of the house. There wasn't a lot of lumber in the garage, but I enlisted Bo to help board up the windows as best as we could. The Fomorian seemed to enjoy breaking in through them, it might help. The dancer. I left her to her own devices. Maybe she'd figure out how to be useful on her own. The Fomorian arrived at the house around midnight. By then I'd reinforced the windows and barricaded the doors with furniture and there wasn't much else I could think of. I'd tried reasoning with the little girl for help, but she only huddled by the kitchen window, weeping quietly. My shotgun was loaded and I kept it close at hand while I brewed coffee. It was going to be a long night, after all. I'd asked the dancer about her companions, but she wasn't worried for their well-being. They weren't the targets of the Fomorians' rage. If they stayed out of the way, the thorns would leave them alone. The Fomorians were tyrants, after all, and it would want someone to rule over once the fairy was dead. She didn't seem pleased at the prospect. We were alerted to the Fomorians' approach by a single bark from the dogs. Brian's head snapped up and he swiveled to stare at the front of the house. I hurried over, catching up my shotgun. Brian had not left the fairy's side, even after he'd finished stitching up the fairy's wounds. They were still unconscious, but stirred faintly at the dog's bark. Brian covered their hand with his own. Silence inside the house. We listened uneasily to the low growls of the dogs outside. Then a voice boomed through the night, rattling the windows, and I sucked in a breath in surprise. "Camp manager," the Fomorian rumbled. "Give me the fairy and I shall spare your companions." "And what will you do with me and the fairy?" I called back. "Quick deaths. You will understand the generosity of such an offer, should you refuse and I take the fairy from you by force." Surprisingly, it was Brian that answered. Quiet, shy Brian, suddenly yelling back at the monstrosity with an anger I'd never heard from him. He told the Fomorian to go to hell. That we'd fight to our last to keep the fairy from him. "Very well," the Fomorian rumbled. "I'll kill you last." And the battle began. The dogs engaged immediately. I ran to the window to look, peering between the boards. The Fomorian was moving slowly. The dogs had targeted his good leg, it seemed, and he could no longer move quickly. The dogs ran circles around him, snapping at his calves and forcing him to fend them off instead of approaching the house any further. Then he swung at one, it connected, and the dog was sent flying through my fence. It stood, shaking itself off, stumbled, and then raced to rejoin the fray. I took a deep breath and started to shove furniture out from in front of the door. I had to help them. The lead dancer seized my arm. I tugged, but her grip was unyielding. Like her hand was made of stone. She stared directly into my eyes. "You'll die," she said. "What happened to go be you at the problem?" I snapped. "Do you have any tricks to play? Or do you just intend to go out there and hope for the best?" I was silent. I was out of ideas. The dogs had come to my rescue so many times. How could I abandon them now? "Wait until dawn," the dancer urged. "The night belongs to evil things. The day belongs to you." She pried the shotgun out of my hand. Then, still holding onto my arm, she forcibly dragged me away from the window. I couldn't look at Brian. He remained by the fairy's side, but I could not imagine the suffering he felt, listening to his dogs snap and snarl outside. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Bo was still there with his mug of coffee and his skull cup. The dancer also seated herself, conspicuously sitting between me and the front door. "They can't keep this up all night," I whispered desperately, keeping my voice down so Brian wouldn't overhear. "It's, 7 hours until dawn still?" The dancer and Bo exchanged reluctant glances. The dogs can keep harrying him, but he's going to keep getting closer to the house. They can't drag him back without taking a hit, and I don't think they're strong enough to survive many of those. Then what? Silence. The dancer stared grimly at the kitchen table. Bo just kept drinking his coffee. Neither seemed willing to speak. They knew I was right. "I'll go," Bo sighed. "I still have the stone. It carries the thorn's death, but perhaps it will also do some harm to the Fomorian." "It'll tear you apart," the dancer said calmly. "If you're lucky, that is." Bo gave a soft nod. Slowly, it dawned on me what was happening. Bo was going out there to die. To reinforce the dogs in an attempt to keep the Fomorian away from the house until dawn, and if that failed, to buy us time as the Fomorian delighted in killing him slowly. I stood, almost knocking my chair over in my haste. "No," I said. "No, We have to find another way. I can call the old sheriff. If his wife could help us, she'd have been here by now. Then something on the campground dash. There's nothing left to oppose it, the dancer snapped. Everything on this campground is too young. It's going to kill us all. Her words rang out loud and clear, and a hush fell over the room. She'd said what we were all thinking. Even if Bo went to help the dogs, it might not be enough. No, it wasn't enough. I glanced into the living room where Brian knelt beside the fairy, refusing to lift his head. He grieved in silence while his dogs gave the last of their lives to buy us perhaps enough time to survive until dawn. We need an ancient thing, I said desperately. This is what we were down to. The only resources we had left to use were our lives. The dogs. Bo's. Or mine. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails biting into my palms. I tried not to think. Like jumping off a cliff, I thought. Just have to be brave for a moment and then gravity will do the rest. Bo, I said. I felt like I was already falling, my body light as a feather. Blood freely given. Take it. All of it. Bo was utterly still. He closed his eyes and his expression softened. I'm sorry, Kate, he whispered. Thank you, but I can't. And a sickening drop in my stomach. My knees trembled and I put a hand on the table to brace myself, shocked by the sudden weakness that flooded through my body. I felt disoriented and there were tears in my eyes and I wasn't sure why I was suddenly crying. But I protested weakly. There's qualifications that have to be fulfilled, the dancer said with unusual gravity. Neither of us meet them. Bo's eyes were still closed. His hand covered the mouth of his skull cup as it sat on the table. His rings glinted dully from the overhead light. But, you have a name, I said plaintively. It's not been enough time. Too many people still think of me as how they always have. You all have tried and you've done wonderfully. You have. But there's still my campers to think of. They've only known him as the person with the skull cup. I haven't printed the new pamphlets yet, the ones that refer to him by name. Perhaps if it were a year from now, after countless people have come and gone and learned to think of him as Bo, the situation would be different. But it wasn't. And I was out of options. I sank back into my chair and buried my face in my hands. So this is it, I said hollowly. The Fomorian wins. No one could answer me. I clenched my hands into fists. No. This wasn't right. This wasn't how my family did things. We didn't just give up. We went out fighting. I thought of my great-aunt, stabbing the harvester in the face with its own scalpel, fighting them to the last even as they held her down and cut her open. I exhaled slowly, feeling that old anger suffusing my veins like the heat from a fire. The Fomorian was here to kill us all, but I would make it damn hard for him. I'd fight to the last and throw my defiance in its face even as I died. I trembled from the intensity of my hatred. Like the world around me would shatter. What are you doing? The little girl whispered through the window. Stop. Kate, stop. A distant roar reverberated through the air. My blood ran cold at the sound. I stared straight ahead, not really seeing anything. Like everything in me had shut down at the noise and I was simply drifting. It was the roar of the beast. The beast was coming. Bo and the dancer both leapt to their feet. The dancer ran to the front window to look outside. Bo slammed his hands down on the table. What did you do? He demanded with uncharacteristic anger. I don't know, I replied weakly. I didn't. The beast was here, hours and hours from dawn. But, wasn't this a good thing? Surely the beast had a grudge against the Fomorian. It wasn't stronger than the Fomorian, but perhaps it could keep it occupied, at least until dawn. The ground shook as the beast grew closer. The Fomorian shouted something, a curse in its own language, I think. And then the windows rattled once more as the two clashed. I ran to the window and peered out into the darkness. I could barely make out the details, the Fomorian obscured by its cloak and the beast's body, as if cut from the night itself. I only saw their glowing eyes, the beast glittering like stars and the Fomorian like a dying sun. The hounds blazed with light, leaving trails as they moved, snapping at the Fomorian's heels, a luminescent dance in the darkness like fireflies. I turned from the window. We had a chance now. My heart beat rapidly with adrenaline as the battle continued. Hours passed. In the stories they talk of how these inhuman creatures will fight until the dawn, all through the night, but it says nothing of the toll it takes on those waiting for a victor. Of the gut-wrenching anxiety and the oppressive fear, the whispering in the back of your mind as you think of what will happen if your side loses, of the death that waits close at hand, waiting for a fatal misstep. But slowly, the sounds of the battle diminished and the points of light that marked its passage receded. The beast was dragging the Fomorian away from the house, step by step. And then at dawn, as the light broke over the trees, the battle was done. Silence descended, only if for a moment. The little girl cried out in terror as the beast wearily claimed its due tribute and slunk away before the burgeoning day. I told everyone gathered in my house to stay where they were. The dancer's words from the previous evening were foremost in my mind. The Fomorian was weakened. It had battled both the dogs and the beast all through the night. I just might be able to finish it off and put an end to all of this. I took only my knife. I felt by instinct that mortal weapons wouldn't do much good here. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The front yard was a mess of torn earth and mudded snow. Blood lay splattered about in frozen droplets. The fence was flattened. And Brian's dogs. There is a story in Irish legends about how the Irish hero Cuchulainn got his name. He was arriving late one evening to the dun of the smith Cullen and the gates were sealed and Cullen's dog was at watch. This was a massive hound, fierce and proud, and protective of its master. Upon seeing Cuchulainn, it mistook him for an intruder, and set upon him. Cuchulainn had no choice but to kill it to save his life and he, wrought with sorrow, brought its body to Cullen who was deeply grieved to see his faithful hound dead. Cuchulainn declared that he would become Cullen's hound, to amend for what he'd done. And so he was named Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cullen. The loyalty of dogs is also their tragedy. When they die, the strength of that bond takes a piece of us with them. I found the dogs sitting at either side of the door. Their eyes were open, staring out at the field beyond. Neither were breathing. Their muscles were locked tight, their joints immobile, still guarding the house in death, as they had throughout the long night. My chest felt tight. I fought back sobs and reached out to touch one. Its body was as cold as ice. And when I touched it, it fell apart, breaking like glass. The pieces drifted in the quiet morning air, floating gently like snowflakes, and they changed from black to a myriad of colors. Blue, yellow, purple and red. Both the dogs were disintegrating now, vanishing before my eyes into a storm of color, fluttering gently in the air. Flower petals. Their bodies drifted away on the cold morning breeze as flower petals. I followed them as they moved across the field that separated the house from the forest. They floated along the path of the battle, strewn with paw prints and the heavy footprints of the Fomorian. I found it at the edge of the forest, kneeling in the snow. Its breathing was ragged and it stared at me with its one good eye as I approached. "Come to kill me, then," it snarled. I did. With that puny knife. It spat into the snow. "I'll break you in two as soon as you come close." I hesitated. There was still time to go back and get the shotgun, I supposed. Judging by the twist to the Fomorian's good leg, it wasn't going anywhere. Brian's voice startled me. He'd come up behind me so quietly that I hadn't noticed. He called my name and I stepped aside when I saw what he had with him. He carried the fairy's boar spear. I stood by, silent as the Fomorian cursed at him in his own foul language. Brian did not flinch. He'd come to do what had to be done to protect the ones he loved, just as he had long ago as a child. He raised the spear, braced himself, and then drove it through the Fomorian's chest. He ripped it free and the Fomorian coughed black blood. The light in its eye faded and its skin shifted in hue, as if it were drained of color. The blood stopped flowing. Stone. It had turned to stone. I cursed under my breath. This was going to be a hassle to remove, because I certainly wasn't leaving something so morbid in full view of my campers. Brian stifled a sob and then he threw the spear away from him, as if he found the touch loathsome. He quickly turned and walked away, but he wasn't going to the house. He was heading for the parking lot and to his car. "Where are you going?" I called after him. "Home," he replied, his voice tight with grief. "I'm going home." Brian never wanted to kill anything. This wasn't the life he wanted. It wasn't long after the Fomorian's death that the old sheriff arrived to drop off his wife. She'd tend to the ferry from here. Bo and the dancer could return to the forest. They both seemed relieved to go. I suppose spending the night in a human house wouldn't be the most pleasant experience for them, even without the threat of a horrible death lurking just outside. I hovered about the living room, uncertain how I could help. The old sheriff's wife finally looked up and fixed me with a steely gaze. "I can take care of my own," she said firmly. "You have something left to do." Startled, I realized what she was referring to. Yes, I did. I quickly put on my jacket as she chided me to dress warmly and hurried out the door. I took the fairy's spear with me. It took a bit of searching, as there wasn't an obvious trail to follow, but sometime around noon I found what I was looking for. The dapple-grey stallion lay in the snow on its side, its legs torn to pieces by the dog's jaws. The bodies of the hounds were not present, but the handful of flower petals resting on top of the snow told me everything I needed to know. They were gone. All of them. I fought back tears as I approached the stricken horse. It weakly raised its head as I drew near, snapping at me in desperation and hate. I could only feel regret as I stood over it. "Poor thing," I said to the dying horse. "You were doomed by the part you had to play, weren't you? Maybe you would have lived a normal life as a normal horse if you hadn't been brought to our land." I raised the spear and brought it down over the horse's chest. The blade easily pierced the thick hide and muscle, down through the ribs, and into its heart. The dapple-grey stallion shuddered once and then it was done. The fairy lay convalescing in my house for days. The old sheriff's wife checked in on them periodically. Brian did not come to visit, and when I called his cell phone, he didn't answer. I finally went to his house to see if he was okay. His mother told me that Brian was gone. He'd taken with him his great-grandma's coat, the one made out of seal skin. "We don't think he's ever coming back." I went to the old church. I found where Brian buried the puppies, all those years ago. There are flowers blooming on their graves, wildflowers, forcing their way up through the snow. Brilliant flowers of blue and purple and yellow, the kind we only see in the summer. I guess their long watch is over. The dogs have protected that which they were summoned to this earth to guard, and now they've passed on to wherever we go after death. And the day after yesterday, the fairy left. I woke to find the sofa empty. Hastily, I threw on some shoes and a jacket and hurried out into the yard. The fairy stood in the field, stroking their deer's neck. I was intensely relieved to see that the deer had survived. I guess it had stayed out of the way after the Fomorian dropped its pursuit. The two turned to look at me as I approached. "What now?" I asked the fairy. "Are you going to stay?" It was hard to see them in the morning sunlight. I tried to shield my eyes with one hand, squinting against the glare from the snow. "No, my task here is done," they replied. "I came to your land long ago because I was following my foe. We just lost track of our purpose for a while." Their gaze drifted to stare at the horizon. This had never been their home. Just a place to stay for a brief time in their immortal life. I'm going to return home, they continued. I'll try to find Brian. Perhaps Manannán will be willing to help. I don't know if Brian will be able to forgive me, but I'd like to try. They looked tired. Their long war was over, but victory was a brief, fleeting moment, and now that it was done we were left with the aftermath. The healing and the grieving and the blame. You're always welcome here, I said. I will remember that. Thank you, campground manager. And good luck. Wearily, they pulled themselves up onto their deer's back. I offered them the boar spear. They regarded it for a moment, and then turned away without taking it. Keep it, they said. You'll need it more than I will. And they left. My campground feels empty now. That night, I went walking through my land. I went down into the old woods. I wasn't grieving our losses. I wasn't happy about our victory. I just felt numb. Eventually, I found myself walking past a brightly lit clearing with people dancing around the light of a roaring bonfire. The former sheriff leaned against a keg and he waved half-heartedly at me before turning his gaze back to the fire. And near the road sat the lead dancer, resting on a log with her legs stretched out before her. Seems a bit inappropriate to be having a party right now, I commented, sitting down beside her. People come and go, she replied dismissively. Were we to mourn every life we come in contact with, we would never stop grieving. This is different, I thought. This wasn't just some camper that passed through for the night. But for all her human mannerisms, the dancer is something else, and the weight of a life feels different for her, and the bonds of friendship may not even exist for her kind. There's something that's been bothering me, I said. You said there's qualifications that have to be met for becoming an ancient thing. If some of the residents here can't ascend, then why are they trying to kill me? It isn't a conscious decision for some of them, she sighed. We all want control. But most of us, if we take the land, will lack the necessary backing to make it stick. It's not enough to just kill you. We have to take authority over the land as well. And authority isn't granted, it's earned. Humans try to ignore that distinction. You said most of them can't ascend. So what can? She was silent for a long moment, listening to the musicians, staring into the fire. I didn't press her. She'd answer when she felt like it, if she answered at all. Of everything on this land, there's only 3 entities that have both the desire and the ability to wrest control from your family, she finally said. You already dealt with 2. I thought about it. The Fomorian was here to kill the fairy and continue a very old war. It wasn't one of the 2. The lady with extra eyes had wanted to kill me so she could ascend, so she was one. Then the second, the man with no shadow. But what made them different? Why could they become ancient but Bo couldn't? I remembered, as if whispered in my ear, the words of the master of the vanishing house. The things it asked for so that it could last. Worship, love, and fear. The man with no shadow was amassing followers so that they would worship him, unwillingly, but it was worship nonetheless. Between that and my death, he would hold sway over this land. The lady with extra eyes had our love. That of my family and that of my campers. I think I understand what the third contender is. The man with no shadow demanded worship. The lady with extra eyes already had our love. The third key, the third thing that will make something last, is fear. 5th story. Don't go camping alone, ever. I ain't scared of nothing. That's what I yelled to my brother as I slammed the door to my car shut. Things have, changed since then. I've changed. I remember his smirk, how he held out my jacket, the way he spouted off an endless list of things I should be scared of, skinwalkers and witches and werewolves, oh my. He presented each one as reason after reason of why this idea was stupid, saying I still had time to flake out, save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my jacket from his grasp, sliding into my car and yelling that I'm not scared before speeding away towards the darkening outline of the mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like teeth. Boy, how I wish I listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm fucking scared. Let me back up a bit. It all started about 2 days ago. I was out of my mind, depressed, could barely get out of bed, thought about chucking myself in front of cars, over bridges, off buildings, just dying. I thought about dying all the time. And enough was enough. One of the few friends I had suggested that I try solo camping said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. He gave me a list of spots, some more isolated than the others. I decided on the most isolated one, which was about a 3-hour hike from the last campsite far out in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. I remember his face, the surprise, the acceptance. "You sure?" His voice cracked. I nodded, saying nothing. "Okay, I mean it's a pretty secluded place, especially for a first-time camper." He shrugged. "But, then again, it's a beautiful spot. It'll definitely give you some perspective. And the night sky out there is insane." I thanked him and turned to leave, but he spoke up again. "Hey, don't let the forest spook you, okay? A word of advice from a veteran: don't go out at night no matter what you hear, you might get totally fucked by a bear or lion." The drive up the mountains was strangely soothing. The gently curving roads that wove their way through the trees and up the rocks were exciting to navigate, and soon my mind was eased into a peaceful contemplation. I had decided to forego electronics this trip, even going as far as securing my phone in my glove box. I wanted to be completely free of all that shit, able to focus on the now rather than ruminate about the past or fear the future. I would be gone for 5 days and 4 nights, enough time for me to, hopefully, recuperate and reassess my life and what I was doing with it. I soon descended into Estes Park and drove through the picturesque town towards RMNP, willing myself not to stay at the Stanley instead. I found the entrance to the park with ease and continued to the closest lot to my campsite. Night was now falling and I silently cursed myself for leaving so late. I sat in my car for a good 30 minutes before deciding that it would be too risky hiking 3 hours in near pitch black. There were 4 other tents set up in the lot I was at with room for one more, and soon I had my own tent set up. That night passed comfortably. I was surrounded by chatting, laughing people and unruly, but happy children who ran round and round screaming. A few of them offered me roasted hot dogs and s'mores and beers, and I filled my belly, smiling. I was rolled up in my sleeping bag before the last light from the dying embers faded away. The second night didn't go so smoothly. I woke up late, well rested, but still groggy, and took my time repacking my tent. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should just stay there, but at 3 p.m. another family showed up with proof they had reserved the site. So, I gathered my things and set off. And immediately got lost. Navigating by map and compass for the first time and alone is a lot harder than it sounds. And the trees. The trees can be misleading, can turn you around, make you think you're on the right path when really you're miles from where you're supposed to be. Instead of taking me 3 hours to get to the site, it took me nearly twice that time, and I was swiftly losing what little light was left in the day. Finally I found the site, but before I breathed a sigh of relief, I haphazardly set up my tent, building a small fire in front. It was dark now and I was jumpy. Every sound I heard was seemingly magnified, every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire, a menace. Spooked, I crawled into the tent and curled up in my bag, trying to will myself into sleep. After a while, I was dozing, about to drift off, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a foot crunching outside. My eyes shot open and I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. I heard the sound again. Someone, or something, was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like whatever they was trying to be quiet, stealthy. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts until I finally decided it was an animal, scavenging for the scraps or inspecting my tent. By dawn I was dozing again and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or two, giving myself time to rest up. I woke up disoriented, exhausted, and started to panic before remembering I was out camping and that I needed to start hiking back. Now. But when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get out there. But deep down I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. So, I began collecting as much wood as I could to build a biggest fire and prepared to hunker down for the night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. The third night was, pretty problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down, waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't kosher for camping, but I was improvising and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small, pathetic, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there, listening, afraid. Finally, I realized I was just being ridiculous, that what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear, that my subconscious, my monkey mind, was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down. And I heard it. Softly at first. A footstep. Then 2. 3. Growing louder, bolder. I sat up and felt my eyes increase to the size of saucers and my breath quickened. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't. I was operating purely off of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running around and around my tent. Suddenly, the side of my tent pushed in as if someone was slapping it from the outside. Hey! I yelled, scared out of my wits. Hey! I'm awake, I'm in here. I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process, and slammed into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with a red-tinted flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away and followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides, their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them and a branch cracked underneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person and they turned their head ever so slightly. Hey, I said again, what the fuck, man? And it boiled up, a sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, and it echoed around me, rattling around in my skull. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping bag, crying. And the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook, like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I fainted. Either way, I woke up the next day to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing, no footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. Fuck this, I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today, in the dark. I couldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to unpole the tent when I heard it, a sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. Help me. Help me. Please, oh God, help me. I reacted more out of instinct than logic and began running towards the sound before realizing that I, in no way, was in a place to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. "Where are you?" I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. "I'm here, where are you?" Quickly the screams descended into a deep, unsettling laughter. Scared out of my mind, I turned and ran back the way I came. By some miracle, I made it back to my site, grabbed my pack, and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me, the mountains loomed up like fangs, like I was about to be swallowed whole by a monstrous mouth. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole of out 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and reeled in horror, too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside. But not just anyone. It was me. Sitting there, pallor and bone thin, a too-wide grin plastered on my face. A single droplet of blood rolled down from each eye which, instead of having green irises, were totally, wholly black. I jumped back, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled up I saw my hand that was not my hand reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face that was not my face looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. I screamed. I stood. I ran. And I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun anymore for guidance since it had almost fully set. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing, was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me up, pushing against me, like they were trying to hold me back, hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly a light flashed in my face and I ran into something solid, something black, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Shit. Oh please God, no 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 no. I heard my own voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down. It's okay. You just scared me. Calm down, what's wrong? I looked up and into the worried grey eyes of a human face. The face of a middle-aged man, to be exact. He was holding me up. The flashlight he was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing, only trees swinging slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, he said again. Was that you? Screaming. I came out here to check. I couldn't speak, I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? He asked, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded. Then began crying. Hey, it's okay. It can be spooky out here. Come on, my car is right over there. He gestured with his head back behind him. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? He glanced at me then away. I'm, a park ranger. But he didn't look like one. He was wearing a smooth black suit, black tie, and white shirt. And his shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. Come on, he said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto his back. As he did so, his jacket flapped slightly and I saw what looked like a SIG Sauer handgun strapped to his belt. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? He shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. He popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. He climbed in the driver's seat and asked me where he should take me. I told him the lot number and we were on our way. After a few moments, he flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Corn nuts? He asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began chomping away. I licked my fingers then looked back at him. So, are you really a ranger? He looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at him, transfixed. He looked exhausted, his wood-colored hair disheveled and dirty from the forest. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop and the man let out a slow, low breath. His eyes narrowed and he looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed his gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me. And there, in the middle of the road, was me. The me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The man looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met his gaze. "I don't get paid enough for this shit," the man muttered before slamming his foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body and the man kept driving, but around us, in between the trees, stirred into the darkness, laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. We reached the lot in silence, bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The man beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now dead, crushed by the car, or at least so badly wounded that it would soon succumb. The SUV slowed to a stop and the man popped the trunk and hopped out. He walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. He handed to me and I took it, then thanked him for everything. "No problem," he said, "all in a day's, or night's, work." His lips quivered as if he was about to smile. I turned to leave, but he spoke up again. "Hey." I turned to face him again. "If you ever want to talk about what you, saw, or, just talk, call me." He held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. Then I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The man was already back in his car. He waved at me, then sped off back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car, and left, breathing a sigh of relief. I still haven't told anyone about what happened, even when they asked why I refused to go camping ever again. I just shrug and tell them it wasn't my thing, that I prefer a warm bed and the bustling sounds of a busy city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call. Wondering who the man really was and if he'd really be able to explain what happened to me.